So we've reached the end of our first section, or our first coding section, and it seems like we might have done quite a lot of work to achieve very little in this case. All we've been able to do is return some values from our database. But in this module, we've actually covered quite a lot of ground. We've taken a look at the .NET CLI to create some projects. We've reviewed the codes in those projects. We've run our application. We've also looked at Entity Framework migrations, which allows us to create our database from our code without us needing to manually do that ourselves. We've then seeded some data into that database so that we can return those values and at the moment display them using Postman. And we've also used Git for our source control as well. But there's something I just want to go back on that we didn't talk about much at the beginning, because I did feel it's important to get our hands dirty with writing some code and creating the projects to try and help us understand about this architecture as we build it, as we go along. And if we just go back to the architecture, and I just want to show you what we're aiming for first of all, and that's this clean architecture. And this rather scary looking slide comes from a book called Clean Architecture by Robert Martin, often referred to as Uncle Bob. And he presented an idea where the domain, or the entities, live at the center of our application universe. And if we map this to what we've done in our project, then the entities here refer to our domain project, the use cases refer to our application project, and the controllers are what we're using inside our API. Now, we haven't done anything with our application projects just yet. We're really just fulfilling the goals of our walking skeleton, which is just to get the tiny implementation of our architecture in place. And if we just go back to our application, then what we've put into place here is the simplified equivalent of this. We've got our domain at the center, we've got our application, which doesn't do anything yet, which will contain our business logic, and we've got our API, which is responding to HTTP requests at the moment. But our API has too much logic in it just now. We don't want our API responsible for directly querying the database, even though it's abstracted by Entity Framework. We want our application business layer or business logic to be responsible for that. And if we compare this with a database-centric architecture, this is the, some would say, more traditional approach to creating an application. Everything would revolve around the data. And it would have our business logic that was revolving around this data, and we would write our business logic to query this data and return it to our user interface. And the architecture we're going for is a different approach to this, and it means our domain project has no dependencies on anything else and is at the center of our application. And that's why we've split out our persistence layer into its own project. But it's very early on in the course, and we will be covering all of this as we build our application and develop it into something a little bit more than just returning a few values from a database. So if we just go to the summary, I just want to discuss some frequently asked questions, the questions that I get asked a lot on any course that I produce. And because all of my courses tend to use VS Code, a common question that comes up is, do I have to use VS Code? And the answer to this is no, not at all. The options are, because we're developing a .NET application, the options really are either Visual Studio, the full-blown version, either 2017 or 2019, or there's another application you can use which is called Rider from a company called JetBrains. They also make the WebStorm IDE, and that one is also very good as well. The downside to Rider is that it's a subscription-based service, and it's not free. But it is cross-platform and you can use it on Windows, Linux or Mac. Visual Studio is only available for Windows. There is a Visual Studio for Mac, but the last time I used it, it was pretty awful experience if I'm honest. But VS Code is not compulsory, but I would recommend giving it a chance for this particular course. Another question that comes up a lot is, do you have to use SQLite? Again, the answer to this is no, and our architecture is being designed so that our database is irrelevant. Well, it's not irrelevant, but it's not the most important thing about what we're building here, and it certainly doesn't matter what database we use. Because we're using Entity Framework, our database technology is abstracted away from our application, and we can swap it whenever we want. and we will swap it later on in the course when we come to publish our application. We're not going to publish an application using SQLite, but I would highly recommend it for development of our application. It's very simple. It means we can instantly spin up a database, a database file, and that will be used to serve our data for our application. And it's incredibly portable because we don't need to install a database server. So if we want to write our code on a different computer, then all we have to do is clone our project from GitHub, restore any dependencies, and begin coding, because we don't need to install any additional software. But like I say, it's entirely possible, but I would actually recommend sticking with the way that we're building the application on this course. Another question you might have is, do we need multiple projects for what we're building here? And the answer to this is emphatically no. Some may even say that we're overcomplicating our projects. Based on the size of our eventual project, it's perfectly possible to have this as a single monolithic project. But there are some advantages to separating it out in this way. We've got a genuine separation of concerns now between our different projects and their responsibilities. And even though it certainly appears it's overcomplicating our design, as we build our application, you won't see any additional complexity. It'll be very simple to understand what we're building here. And that's it for this particular section. What we're going to look at next is the React side of our walking skeleton, and that's coming up next.